Hi, I'm Diane McGarry with Dragett Arts. With me today are co-host Tom McGarry, author Christopher C. Gorham, and ASL interpreter Gay. Christopher holds degrees from the University of Michigan, Tufts University, and Syracuse University College of Law. He practiced law for over a decade, and for the last several years has taught modern American history at Westford Academy in Westford, Massachusetts. His writing has appeared in the Washington Post, Literary Hub, Paper Brigade Daily, and online publications. The Confederates is his first, or The Confederate, sorry, didn't mean to make two of them, is his first book. He and his wife Elizabeth live in Watertown and Chatham, Massachusetts. I'm so glad you're with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Diane, thank you for having me. Diane and Tom and Gay, thank you for having me. And thanks to folks for tuning in. What I'd like to do on this beautiful day here is read from my book, The Confidant, which I'll show here. It's the untold story of the woman who helped win World War II and shape modern America. It's the first ever biography of a woman named Anna Rosenberg, who was a Jewish Hungarian immigrant in the early years of the 20th century. And by the late 1920s, she had come into the orbit of the Roosevelts, Franklin and Eleanor, and found herself, when Roosevelt was elected president in 1932, found herself the only woman regional director of massive New Deal programs. And by World War II, she had become a close confidant to Franklin Roosevelt. In fact, met with him some 130 times one-on-one, which is more than most cabinet members. So she was, during World War II, she had a remarkably close relationship with the president. She was sort of an all-around fixer, but that word sort of has negative connotations. So, but she was putting out fires across the country that helped the nation achieve victory in war and prosperity and peace. What I'd like to do first is read the prologue, which is the very, very beginning of the book. If you bought the book, The Confidant, you would open it up and read this story here, which is a true story. Let me just, I just have to look at my notes here for 1 second, and then I'll get to reading. All right. Her papers are at Harvard, Massachusetts, or Harvard University. I found the papers in 2019, and what I'm about to read is a true story. So let's get started. The prologue: The Eagle's Nest, Kelstein Mountain, Berchtesgaden, Bavaria, Germany, Saturday, May 19th, 1945. Anna Marie Rosenberg stood in the great room of the Eagle's Nest, Adolf Hitler's redoubt in the Bavarian Alps. She gazed into the valley below with its deep blue glacial lakes, bordered by wildflowers. The jagged peaks on the other side punctured the horizon as shafts of brilliant late spring sunshine angled through the giant octagonal room. Here, she thought with a chill, the Fuhrer had sat in the armchair by the fire, his German shepherd at his feet, while high-ranking Nazis and their courtesans clinked glasses of looted champagne, their faces flushed as they delighted in transforming Europe into a slaughterhouse. How could such a beautiful spot have housed such depravity? She thought of her family, Hungarian Jews forced to flee Budapest more than 30 years before due to the caprice of the Austro-Hungarian emperor. Anna's father, Albert Lederer, responded to his exile by becoming a fiercely patriotic American, a posture he encouraged his daughter to adopt as well. My father was vehement in his belief that everyone born outside the United States owed a special obligation to this country, Anna later explained. His influence on me was so great. He drilled into me that I must serve the United States, and that attitude of great love you couldn't help but assimilate. While Anna and her family struggled to find their footing in New York, back in the old world, the emperor's nephew was assassinated, plunging Europe into the world's first industrial modern war. A generation later, dispatched to battle-torn Europe by President Franklin Roosevelt in the fall of 1944 to serve as his personal emissary, Anna found the land of her childhood again caught up in the dragnet of war. On this second mission, Anna was in the heart of the imploding Nazi state. Though she had heard terrible stories of roundups, ghettos, and camps, Anna was unprepared for the tragic scenes she witnessed at the Nordhausen concentration camp just days after its liberation by American troops in April of 1945. Wearing a borrowed woman's Army Corps uniform, Anna climbed down from her Jeep into a nightmarish world of suffering and anguish. Among pyres of corpses, the survivors shuffled in a daze, their striped prison uniforms in rags. Medics, chaplains, and soldiers raced, saving the living, comforting the dying, and digging long trenches for the dead. I saw survivors, she said, ragged and ageless. Few could stand up. One woman, shocked at the sight of an Allied woman in the camp, slowly approached her. After a moment's hesitation, Anna groped for items at the bottom of her purse and the man's briefcase she always carried. She tenderly put them in the woman's hands caked with dirt. Anna was ashamed at the insufficiency of her gesture. How could she give lipsticks and note pencils to a starving woman? But seeing the face of the woman as she closed her hands over these small tokens gave Anna hope. To this woman, Anna recalled later, it was everything. It was the first thing she had owned in years. Everything had been taken from her. Even her name had been blotted out by the Nazi stamp, Juden. Gazing at the Edelweiss in the valley below, Anna thought of the young men who would never get to go home, or who, like her son Thomas, a lieutenant in the U.S. Army, would return carrying the trauma of what they'd seen. In the field hospital at Saint-Lô, a wounded American brought in a French child, quote, her body torn and shattered by a wood mine, end quote, left by a German retreat. He cried, Anna said. This soldier cursed. He prayed. The soldier promised, I'll pay them back for this. She thought of the generals she now considered friends, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, and General George S. Patton. What toll had been taken on them as they saw the terrible price exacted by Hitler's divisions from the beaches of Normandy across the Rhine River into the very heart of the Third Reich. But most of all, as she stood there in the eagle's nest watching dust particles suspended in the sunlight, she thought of the man who had sent her here, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. She remembered the last time they were together, sharing a lunch in the small sun parlor of the White House on a pleasant Saturday in March, just a few weeks before he died. Before leaving the White House that day for what would be his very last time, the president directed Anna to make this second mission to Europe, to learn from the soldiers themselves what they hoped for when they returned home. Anna took one long last look at the magnificent Bavarian Alps as the shadows lengthened across the valley. She turned and walked into the library that abutted the great room. On one end was a huge stone fireplace, and at the other sat a mahogany desk. She picked up the folded copy of Stars and Stripes that sat on the desktop. An article caught her eye. An American private would be giving a piano recital at the Mozarteum concert hall in nearby Salzburg. Classical music was one of the few indulgences Anna allowed herself. Moving most days like a hummingbird, she prized the moment she found to slip into a hall or a conservatory, just another anonymous listener, as the orchestra went through its afternoon rehearsal. She ached to go to the private's performance, but she knew she could not. There was too much work to be done. She looked up from the newspaper at the tall bookcase behind the desk. A title caught her attention. 10 Jahre Hitler, 10 Jahre Roosevelt. In German, it means 10 years of Hitler, 10 years of Roosevelt. Anna stood to her full 5'3", and with her substantial heels of the WAC boots, she was able to reach this book. Flipping it open, she saw images of Depression-era Americans. A man in a dirty undershirt ladled soup amid the pitiful detritus of makeshift homeless camps. Idle, unemployed men squatted on a bench, their caps pulled low over their eyes. There were photographs of President Roosevelt shaking the hand of a black man and with Jewish American leaders. Anna flipped through the pages and saw a photograph of her friend and mentor, Bernard Baruch. The German text beneath decried America as the home of mongrels and gangsters. Juxtaposed against these images were columns of neatly uniformed youths, German youths marching in a mountain valley, a swastika flag held high. Dozens of strong, tall Aryan women in matching outfits performed calisthenics. Hitler, surrounded by his generals, was fixated on a military map. 10 years. A decade before, Anna would have been in New York or Washington or on a train between the two. It was peacetime then, but the Great Depression hung over America like a heavy curtain. Now here she was at the end of a world war, the immigrant girl who was inspired to a lifetime of patriotic duty, the woman who became a vital wartime advisor to the American president, standing in the crown jewel of Hitler's evil empire. Just then, she heard her aide speaking French in the corridor with a few officers of the French 2nd Armored Division. The men were still gloating over the French and American flags atop the Eagle's Nest, a great symbolic prize they dreamed of since D-Day. Lieutenant Commander Fisher stuck his head into the library. Mrs. Rosenberg? Anna slipped a book into her briefcase and tucked on her khaki hat at the angle she liked. It was time to go. There was work to do. That's the prologue from the Confidant. Two things about that I'll talk a little more about. One, Anna Rosenberg spoke German. She'd been born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. She spoke Hungarian and she spoke German. So when she is at the Eagle's Nest in May of 1945, she's able to read what's in the book and understand what was going on. The concert that was given by an American private at the Mozarteum, the reason I knew to research that is because my grandfather on my mother's side had been to that concert. He was a captain in the 69th Infantry Division, and after 90 days of combat, including combat in Leipzig, Germany, at the end of the war, his unit went to Salzburg, and he had fond memories of that beautiful part of the world. Not such fond memories of Leipzig, Germany, where they fought against 800 SS men. But in Salzburg, he was able to go to that concert and was, for the rest of his life, his long life, marveled at the artistry of the Mozarteum. So when I found that article in Stars and Stripes, it really it was really important to me to see that. Anna Rosenberg, before the war at the beginning of the war, as America is getting closer to Pearl Harbor, or Pearl Harbor is getting closer to America, I should say, Roosevelt put her in charge of an Office of Defense, Health, and Welfare. And her assistant was none other than David Rockefeller, because Anna was the mentor of, if you can believe this, even though she was a pioneering mediator and was very, very pro-union, she was also a mentor to the two Rockefeller brothers, David and Nelson. But here it's David Rockefeller. And Anna was given, I'm reading here, Anna was given emergency powers to ensure adequate transportation, housing, schooling, health facilities, and public safety for these swollen towns and expanded military bases that were filling up as America got closer to sending off the troops for battle. She was in charge of these bases in New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. Once a month, Anna and her staff met with military, municipal, and industry leaders at the ballroom of the Hotel Astor in Times Square. Perched on the stage were Anna and her staff, and what they were doing is trying to sort out any issues that were at these military bases and make sure that the training was going well for the soldiers and their families. Perched on the stage was Anna and her staff. On the long table sat two telephones, a black one and a red one. The red one, she said, was a direct line to the White House. The monthly meeting started with a recap of the last meeting's priorities. David, where's our list? Okay. Now, Admiral, last month you promised you would soon have more housing at your Navy Yard, yes? Well, Mrs. Rosenberg, you see? Not yet, Admiral. Am I seeing that housing? Well, no, Mrs. Rosenberg, there's a problem. We can't get enough lumber. Anna grabbed the red phone. Anna Rosenberg here. Is he there? Good. Fine. Listen. Admiral Smith says, thanks. See you soon. Goodbye, darling. It took just a minute. According to David Rockefeller's assistant, in the several meetings I attended, I was unable. So this is David Rockefeller's assistant talking. In the several meetings I attended, I was unable to ascertain whether the red phone was actually connected to any terminal, let alone one at the White House. Nevertheless, the missing lumber, the elusive plumbing, or the scarce medical supplies somehow miraculously appeared when needed. So that's one of the many jobs that Anna Rosenberg had after the war broke out in 1939 and after the United States gets closer to war in 1940 and 41, and indeed after the United States joins the war after Pearl Harbor. She, in fact, one of her nicknames was Seven Job Anna. And another nickname that Roosevelt gave her in the newspapers was Mrs. Fix-It. So she was, according to President Roosevelt, his Mrs. Fix-It. And she was sent, like I said, around the country to put out fires and to deal with issues that mostly would have been under the umbrella of the Secretary of Labor. But what Roosevelt did, which was not very nice of him, is he would often put people on parallel tracks. So he would, put Frances Perkins on the same job as, say, Anna Rosenberg, and whoever got there first and got the solution he wanted would get the accolades. And so that made Secretary Perkins not super fond of Anna Rosenberg, even though Anna was always very deferential to the older woman. After the war, Anna, who is very involved in the direction of the GI Bill. In fact, her mission to Europe helped formulate the educational thrust of the GI Bill. And after the war, she immediately went back to New York City, and she helped with Jewish refugees, the refugees of the Holocaust, raised millions of dollars for them. And she also was the director of the New York City Veterans Affairs Office, which was a huge job because the New York City, greater metropolitan New York, had millions of veterans that were returning. And after about 1948 or so, she goes back into civilian life. The new president is Truman. She's very close to Truman, but she wants to get back home to New York. It had been a long time that she'd been splitting time between New York and Washington. So Anna goes back to New York City, and she finally buys the apartment that she's rented for decades. And she takes out some loans to get back on her feet. She restarts her business, a labor relations business. Her son comes back safely from World War II. He gets married, and life is good. And in 1950, 2 years after this sort of peaceful period of her life, Anna Rosenberg receives a letter from the Secretary of Defense, who at the time was General George C. Marshall. And the letter says, "Dear Anna, would you entertain an offer to become the Assistant Secretary of Defense and come down to Washington to the Pentagon to work with me as my number two?" This is during the Korean War, folks. So Anna says to him, she said in her diary, she said, "I could not say no to the general. I venerated the man." But she also had to be honest with him. She said, "General, before I agree to this, please know I wear multiple bullseyes. I'm a civilian. I'm known to be pro-union. I'm an immigrant. I speak with an accent. I'm a woman. I'm a civilian. I'm Jewish. They're going to come after me. And General, they're going to come after you." But to the general's credit, Marshall stuck with her and said to her, "We will get through this together." And so he did, in fact, nominate her to the Assistant Secretary of Defense position. And the Armed Services Committee approved her unanimously. And all that remained was the full Senate vote. Now, this was just a formality because she'd been unanimously approved by the committee. The issue arose when Senator Joe McCarthy heard on a radio program by a very nasty journalist named, I'm going to forget his name, but he was sort of a Rush Limbaugh of his day. Senator McCarthy heard about this nomination and didn't want it to go forward. He thought, he certainly didn't want a woman. He didn't want a Jewish woman. He didn't want a civilian woman. He was who he was. So he bought a 2-week delay, even though he wasn't on the Senate Armed Services Committee. He bought a 2-week delay to conjure up a smear campaign. And what I'm going to read for you next, just looking at my time here, what I'm going to read for you next is this extremely dramatic moment in December of 1950 where the Senate Armed Services Committee had to reopen the hearings. And Senator McCarthy had found this stooge from New York who would testify under oath that Anna Rosenberg was secretly a communist, that she was disloyal and secretly a communist. So it's just this absolutely crazy moment. I just have to read it to you. The chapter is called Enemies Within, and the action takes place in December 1950. Now, by the time this chapter happens in the book, she's a decorated public servant. She didn't need this. She agreed to come back to Washington because General Marshall wanted her to do so, and she was the best person for it. But here's what happened. Enemies Within. Establishing herself anew in Washington, Anna lived at the Shoreham Hotel as she had during World War II, not far from the leafy lanes and boutiques of Georgetown. There, Anna installed herself in a 5-room suite and began to reacquaint herself with life in the capital. First, she sent for some favorite objets d'art from her Fifth Avenue apartment to make the suite feel like home. French paintings on the walls comforted her, as did a porcelain Chelsea figurine on her desk, topped in white leather. Large plants abounded. Leaves were glossy from the ministrations of mineral oil. A vase of pink roses stood on the long dining room table, with vases of white gladiolas elsewhere. The closet full of fine clothes, furs, and hats added to the luxury, but Anna would have little occasion to wear furs in Washington this time around. Her social life in the capital had never matched that of New York City, but by working 12 to 16 hours at the Pentagon, Anna's social life nearly evaporated. The only rare indulgences being the National Symphony Orchestra at Constitution Hall or good Gallic cuisine at La Salle du Bois or Chez Francois. Once Anna was confirmed by the Senate Armed Services Committee by unanimous vote, all that remained was the formality of the full Senate vote. The day after the confirmation hearing, however, Senator Joseph McCarthy, who was not on the Senate Armed Services Committee, persuaded Senate Minority Leader Nebraska's Kenneth Wherry to postpone Rosenberg's confirmation. McCarthy then enlisted Congressman John Rankin, a notorious anti-Semite from Mississippi, and together they made haste. On Friday, December 1st, 1950, Rankin met with bespectacled retired businessman Benjamin H. Friedman, a character described by Time magazine as a peculiar and disgruntled zealot, a self-styled excommunicated Jew. The wealthy Friedman was a Holocaust denier and a financer of common sense, a quote, wild-eyed anti-Semitic hate sheet. The 4-page November issue, including a mail order form for the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, attacked Rosenberg for, quote, coming from the heart of Eastern European Yiddish population, and whose record was filled with, quote, subversive pro-communist activity. In a perversion of the memory of Thomas Paine, Friedman mailed Common Sense to 25,000 recipients, including all the names in the Congressional Directory, newspaper and radio columnists, and prominent Washingtonians. Also present at this meeting was Gerald L.K. Smith, who sought to, quote, keep the Zionist Jew from becoming dictator of the Pentagon. Following his meeting with two of the nation's most notorious extremists, Congressman Rankin took to the floor of the House chamber, where he described Anna as a little Yiddish woman from Austria-Hungary. In his speech read into the congressional record, Rankin went on, the American people are aroused and indignant that this exalted position, one of the most powerful in the world, should be turned over to one foreign-born individual whose record for association with communist organizations show that she is unfit to occupy such a place of responsibility. If Rosenberg were to be confirmed, hyperventilated Rankin, expect to see these communists packed into our Defense Department by the thousands. Echoing this diatribe was Congressman Claire Hoffman of Michigan, who inserted into the record a slur calling Anna this Budapest Jewess. Because congressional debate is largely immune from libel laws, the Michigan Republicans' tactic was meant to give Smith's hateful rhetoric the maximum circulation and protection under the law. Over in the Senate, Senator McCarthy provided an audience to Reverend Wesley Smith, who had been a KKK organizer before establishing a church for white supremacists, and whose public pronouncements included such things as all Jews must be destroyed. Mrs. Rosenberg, according to the Reverend, was not only a Jewess, but an alien from Budapest with socialistic ideas. While McCarthy was hosting the Good Reverend, Texas Congressman Ed Lee Gossett squired Benjamin Friedman to the chambers of the Senate Armed Services Committee, where Friedman delivered the coup de grace in the form of two anti-Rosenberg affidavits. The first was signed by a former investigator for the Dies Committee, claiming to have seen damaging information on Rosenberg in a leaked copy of her FBI file, and the other was a statement by a former communist, Ralph DeSola, who claimed to have proof that Rosenberg was secretly a communist and was willing to testify against her. The very next day, December 5th, Acting Chair Senator Richard Russell of the Armed Services Committee convened an executive session. Based on these two sworn affidavits, he had no choice but to reopen the hearings. McCarthy and the other plotters were triumphant, as they well knew just the fact that a loyalty hearing was going to be held was enough to end careers like those of Dorothy Kenyon, Marcia Harris, and Esther Brownhour. It appeared that Anna Rosenberg's career would end in disrepute. In this year of histrionics and hysteria, Anna said, these accusations were very frightening and very bewildering. Hoping to avoid indirectly besmirching General Marshall's career, Anna offered to resign. The old man would have none of it. It was the only time I ever saw him get mad, Anna recalled. To obtain the FBI file himself, George Marshall invited Director J. Edgar Hoover to lunch. Marshall loathed Hoover, hated the guy. Anna, he confessed, I'd send for the devil if it would help get this cleared up. The gambit worked. Marshall was able to privately review the file. The only outrage was how doggedly the Dies Committee had tracked Anna's every interaction with groups they considered subversive, including civil rights organizations, consumer groups, and trade unions. To allow the loyalty hearing to go forward was risky, but Secretary Marshall would not bow to Joe McCarthy. We will stick this out, he promised Anna. Friday, December 8th, 1950 was cold, raw day in the nation's capital, the unusually strong winds making it feel close to freezing. At 11 o'clock that morning, tall and slender Ralph DeSola, this is the man who's going to testify against her, strode in a fedora and a gray double-breasted suit into the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing room. Wearing wire-rimmed circular glasses, his black hair combed straight back, DeSola raised his right hand and was sworn in as the committee's first witness. His testimony started off with claims that he recognized Anna Rosenberg from a brief encounter 15 years in the past. DeSola claimed he'd spoken to Anna once at a communist club meeting in 1935 and had seen her at 4 or 5 different meetings. The committee was skeptical, given that Anna Rosenberg was a common name. How could he be sure that it was this Anna M. Rosenberg? Senators then asked the witness multiple times to provide a physical description. How tall was she? How much did she weigh? What color was her complexion, her hair? What was the shape of her face? DeSola responded to the grilling, but Senator William Nolan of California seemed incredulous that DeSola had such a recollection of a person he had casually met 15 years before. The senator insinuated that he was remembering her from newspaper photos rather than any communist club meeting. He said, and you remember talking to Mrs. Rosenberg, I'm sorry, Senator Lyndon Johnson followed up, and you remember talking to Mrs. Rosenberg on only one occasion. In his measured Texas drawl, said Lyndon Johnson. That's right, DeSola answered. And you remember how her voice sounded when you talked with her on that one occasion? I think so. Massachusetts Senator Leverett Saltonstall then wanted to know why, if DeSola had known Anna Rosenberg to be a communist, had he kept quiet for a decade and a half, completely ignoring her war-related work at home and abroad that had been reported by every major newspaper in the country. DeSola reasoned that Rosenberg had been involved in, quote, social work in the Roosevelt administration, and accordingly, there had been no reason to sound the alarm. But now he said, I feel as if a communist agent were as close as Mrs. Rosenberg to the Secretary of Defense, it would be tremendously harmful. By the early afternoon, DeSola's unconvincing testimony was leading to embarrassing surprises. Asked whether he had met with any members of Congress prior to testifying, DeSola admitted that he had been visited in his New York City apartment late one night by two men who claimed to be from the Armed Services Committee. This is De Sola now talking into the record. One of them, I think he stated, was from Senator McCarthy's office. He told me when I came down here, that's where I could leave my things, and any messages were coming for me, I could leave them in room 254, Senator McCarthy's office. That's where I went this morning. So McCarthy sends these two goons to this guy's apartment in New York at like 1 a.m. to get this affidavit. That's how they got it. There was an astonished silence. Senator McCarthy was not on the committee. What was he tampering with the witness? The committee members were shocked at conduct so unbecoming of a member of the nation's largest legislative body. By the time they took a recess at 1:30, the committee had heard enough. They were ready to dismiss De Sola so he could make the 4:00 train back to New York. Anna, however, put an end to that plan. Chairman Russell, by way of offering her a chance to make an opening statement, asked Rosenberg, "Do you care to make a comment?" After having painfully listened to De Sola for 2.5 hours, Anna, quote, trembling with wrath, said the Chicago Tribune, exploded. "He is a liar, and I would like to lay my hands on that man, Senator. It is inhuman what he has done to me in the past few days, and I'm grateful to you people for the time you've spent. But I listened to the radio last night, and my family listened and heard that I am charged with disloyalty. Now, if this man is crazy or a communist, I want to face him, Senator. I have never been a member of the John Reed Club. I have never been a communist. I have never sympathized with communists. I have spent my life trying to do something to help my country. I was ashamed to have charges like these made against me. Forgive me. You know I've been here all day long, but this has been a terrible ordeal for me. Please let me face this man." She goes on, "Please forgive me. Maybe all this is wrong, but I plead with you, finish this. If you don't think I am fit to take this office, say so. I don't care what you charge me with, but not disloyalty. Don't do that, Senator. It is an awful thing to carry around with you." This was a much different Anna than the committee had seen back on November 29th. To historian Elizabeth Collins, this was a well-timed display of rage, and it was perfectly pitched. While she was adept at shifting her persona depending on her audience or circumstance, since she had been a teenage suffragette, Anna was capable of outbursts of genuine anger when her core beliefs, the women's right to vote, social equality, fidelity to a democracy, and loyalty to America, were challenged. This was Anna's instinctive outrage at being labeled disloyal to her country by a character like Ralph De Sola. To journalist Fred Cook, it was a cry from the heart. Emotions continued to run high once back in the hearing room. "My dear man, what in hell is the matter with you?" Anna demanded of Ralph De Sola when they came face to face. "I have never seen this man in my life," she said to the senators. The Anna Rosenberg in the file had been a writer. So the FBI file, or rather some of the negative things had been about Anna Rosenberg, who was a writer. And it turns out there was another Anna Rosenberg who was a communist, but it wasn't this one. So Anna says, "I've never been a writer. What's more," she said, "I am Anna Marie Rosenberg, Anna M. Rosenberg." In a bizarre exchange, De Sola challenged Anna to prove her innocence by producing other Anna Rosenbergs, including the writer who had attended the communist meetings. Anna shot back, "It is up to you to look at them before making such an accusation against me." De Sola then countered, "I am far from convinced that you are not exactly who I think you are." I mean, what a bizarre thing that was going on. Anna fired back, "Mr. De Sola, I am not here to convince you. I don't believe that any human being wants to do what you are doing purposely. You came into this room and you said, 'This is the woman.' You never even looked at me. Do you know what you're doing to me?" De Sola then looked her up and down. Was she the same Anna Rosenberg as the one he'd seen 15 years before? "Would you mind standing up, Mrs. Rosenberg?" She did. "I will stand up," she shot back, glaring at him. "Now tell me, am I the woman from the Communist Club?" "Yes," De Sola said to the senator, "she's it. I recognize her." Time seemed to stand still. This was the face-to-face encounter that had ended so many careers in previous loyalty hearings. From the witness chair, Anna saw her home state Senator Herbert Lehman attending the hearing, although he was not part of the committee. He was in shock at the audacity of the lie and undone by the character assassination playing out before him. Tears were rolling down his cheeks. But there was no time for self-pity. What do you have to say to that? Chairman Russell asked Anna. She shot back, it's a goddamn lie. The hearing room suddenly went silent, but for the scribbling pens and pencils of reporters. A moment later, echoing the earlier inquiry from Senator Saltonstall, Anna wanted to know why DeSola sat on this information for 15 years without telling anyone. He responded, because I am sorry to see that we have a Secretary of Defense who has to be assisted by a communist. I am sorry for our country. If you had been put in Social Security Agency work, where at most it was a question of some sort of social work or welfare work, I would have said cynically to myself, well, those people get there anyway. She can't do much harm. Just a moment, thundered Chairman, cutting off DeSola. We will proceed in an orderly fashion. DeSola's chauvinistic remark that the social work was women's work was unimportant turned out to be the last the committee heard from him. Anna, quote, trembling and choking with rage, according to a reporter, got the last word in. I would like to get on the record, Mr. Chairman, that I have never seen that man in my life. After the day's testimony, a spent Anna was approached by Lyndon Johnson in the corridor. Now, they were great friends. They were wonderful friends. Anna had known Johnson since he came to Washington as a young congressman in thrall to FDR. It was the beginning of a 35-year friendship and working relationship between Anna and LBJ. But at this moment, Lyndon Johnson was angry. In the Bible Belt, and especially a woman, don't ever use language like that again. Lyndon, she said, someday when you're confronted with an accusation that staggers you, you'll say it too. I sure will, he said, but that's all right. I'm a man. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. You were muted for a second. I think there was just a freeze, but yes, we can hear you fine now, Chris.
Okay. All right. I sure will, admitted LBJ, but that's okay if I curse because I'm a man. Ralph DeSola was back on the train to New York, but Friday's testimony left several questions unanswered. Who were the two investigators, one of whom claimed to represent Senator McCarthy? How large of a role was McCarthy playing in all this? Was he the mastermind of the campaign against Anna Rosenberg? Or was it radio provocateur Fulton Lewis? And where was that FBI file? Regardless of who was behind the case against Anna, as Fulton Lewis crowed on his radio show that evening, there had been a positive identification. It was DeSola's word against Anna's. When the hearings resumed on Monday, December 11th, a slate of witnesses were to corroborate DeSola's story. At this point, the case against Anna Rosenberg began to unravel, beginning with the appearance of Helen Winter, DeSola's ex-wife. Her former husband, she said, was sort of on and off unemployed. Not only did he seesaw between jobs, but his fanaticism and extremism took him from ardent communist to anti-communist witness for hire. Asked about DeSola's truthfulness, she hedged. He's a truthful person with some limitations. He believes what he says. It is an awfully difficult thing to explain, senators. Is he well balanced? Asked Senator Lester Hunt. Is this going to appear someplace? These are very hard things to say at a public hearing. When the committee asked if DeSola was of good sound mind, Mrs. Winter asked to respond off the record. She was thereafter dismissed. DeSola's reputation for veracity took another hit when a coworker told the committee DeSola time and again proved himself to be telling complete falsehoods. I wouldn't rely on any statement he made under oath or otherwise. A former supervisor of DeSola's judged him to be a person of extreme dishonesty who would stop at nothing for bits of notoriety, which would make him stand out. 15 ex-members of this communist club denied ever knowing Anna Rosenberg. Witnesses who were scheduled to appear went truant. The odor of the affair observed Eleanor Roosevelt, got too bad for some of the witnesses who were supposed to appear against her. Others changed their testimony, and still others did more damage to their case. A woman named Marjorie Sheeran, who had been fired as a low-level congressional staffer, spun a bizarre tale that Rosenberg was, along with President Truman, members of Congress, and leading Americans, part of a, quote, giant conspiracy emanating from Moscow, end quote. In response, the letter of termination from the senator who fired her was read into the record, and it included these words. It is my considered opinion that Mrs. Sharon is hysterical, psychopathic, and a completely untrustworthy individual whose testimony is deserving of absolutely no credence whatsoever. Long before her time was up, she too was dismissed. From the moment DeSola's testimony ended on December 8th, the hearing had been digging up, in Time's pungent phrase, a veritable seagull's nest of rotting political fish heads. By the end of Tuesday's hearing, after witness upon witness had blown holes in DeSola's story, it was clear the case against Anna Rosenberg was no more than a flimsy tissue of lies. That evening, a number of politicians and prominent Washingtonians attended a dinner dance at the Sulgrave Club for the heiress of a prominent publishing family. The cheeky hostess sat two bitter enemies at the same table, Senator Joe McCarthy and the most influential syndicated columnist in the country, Drew Pearson. With his column appearing in 600 newspapers, Pearson had written 40 columns against McCarthy, including several alleging the senator was a tax cheat. In response, McCarthy denigrated Pearson on the floor of the U.S. Senate, calling him a communist tool, an agent of Moscow, all the while shielded by the cloak of immunity against libel and slander for senatorial pronouncements. Seeing Pearson take his seat across the table on what had been a long, deflating day must have curdled the senator's already sour mood. I am going to tear you limb from limb, he told Pearson across the table, glass of whiskey in his hand. Say, Joe, Pearson sniped back, have you paid your income taxes yet? How long are they going to let you stay out of jail? Then, according to Pearson, the senator from Wisconsin called him a GD son of a bitch, a goddamn son of a bitch. Sorry about all the swearing, by the way. This is terrible. Pearson rose to respond, but the wife of a Washington lawyer intervened. Don't be a fool. Sit down. Can't you see he's been drinking? The two men retreated, but Pearson kept a wary eye on the senator, who had a glass in his hand all evening. As the party drew to a close, Drew Pearson went to the cloakroom. As he reached into his pocket for tip money for the coat check girl, Joe McCarthy emerged from the shadows, and Pearson felt a bear claw grab his shoulder. McCarthy, quote, pinned my hands down, Pearson said, swung me around, and proceeded to kick me in the groin with his knee. Just then, Congressman Richard Nixon, a fellow red baiter, walked in. McCarthy slapped Pearson hard across the face. That one was for Dick Nixon, he said. McCarthy then rumbled out into the night, later making a drunken call to a conservative journalist to brag that he'd kicked Drew Pearson in the nuts. I thought I was going to kill him. I thought he was going to kill him, said Nixon later. The next month, Pearson sued McCarthy for the injuries he sustained in the assault. I'll read just a little bit more. How am I doing on time?
You are great. It's 2:45.
All right. I have just a little bit more here. 12 hours later, in the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing room, hundreds of letters were placed in the record praising Anna Rosenberg in extraordinarily warm terms. The letters were from ordinary Americans, as well as those from General Eisenhower, the CIA director, Avetta Culp Hobby, the publisher of the Houston newspaper, elder statesman Bernard Baruch, FDR's one of his vice presidents, James Burns, and the widow of Fiorello LaGuardia. In fact, letters came in from, quote, everybody you ever heard of who is the head of anything, end quote. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon the next day, December 14th, 1950, the committee voted unanimously again to reapprove her nomination as Assistant Secretary of Defense. A week later, by overwhelming voice vote, the full U.S. Senate approved Anna's nomination. Rather than besmirching Anna Rosenberg, the hearings, concluded Senator Benton, brought, quote, to the attention of the Senate and to the country as a whole Anna's remarkable background and record and extraordinary qualifications. As she exited the Senate office building to head back to work at the Pentagon, reporters asked Anna for a comment. I am proud of our democracy. When I got word, Anna told General Marshall's biographer, I rushed to General Marshall's office. This is her boss at the Pentagon. This is Secretary of Defense George Marshall. He and the Joint Chiefs had their coats on. She said, I was choked up because she's just been approved. Breaking into tears, Anna told Marshall she had been confirmed as Assistant Secretary of Defense. General Marshall bent down and kissed her on the cheek. That's wonderful, Anna. I know you've been through hell. Now go home and fix your makeup. That's an order. That there's a little bit left in that chapter, but I think I've kind of told the story. But I will leave you with this. This is the true end of the chapter. Anna was very close to, oddly enough, or not odd. It wasn't odd. It was uncommon for anybody to be friends with both Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt at the same time. They had separate teams. You were on Team Eleanor or you were on Team Franklin, and rare was the person who could sit between those two powerful figures. Harry Hopkins was one, Aubrey Williams was another, and Anna Rosenberg was a third. But she was very, very close to Eleanor, and they exchanged correspondence for many, many years. In fact, until Eleanor died in the 1960s. So after this episode, Anna wrote Eleanor a letter. And in the letter, this is what she wrote. This is 2 days before the full Senate vote. She wrote, I didn't believe that anyone who has lived the way I have and worked the way I have could be accused in such a way. Maybe this nightmare that I've gone through will have one good result, that it will serve as a shocking example of what can be done to human beings who are trying to do an honest job. Maybe it will wake us up to the fact that we have not only enemies without, but very dangerous ones within. So that's enemies within. She went on to serve 26 months at the Pentagon during the Korean War with tremendous success. She made 2 trips to Korea in the battle zone. She accelerated the integration of the armed forces. In fact, when she got to Korea, a journalist said, how many black troops are serving in Korea? And she said, that's not the question. The question is how many American troops are serving. So when she left at the end of the Truman administration, she was with tremendous accolades from that administration for her service at the Pentagon. And indeed, she kind of skipped over Kennedy because Kennedy saw her only as a fundraiser, but she went on to be an advisor to President Lyndon Johnson, again, who had been a very close friend to her for many, many years. So a remarkable story. A woman in public life from 1928, give or take, to her death in 1983. The first biography of Anna Rosenberg, The Confidante.
That's great. It's a wonderful, wonderful story. I really enjoyed reading it so much.
Thank you, Diane.
Sure. You have another book coming out you were mentioning to me.
I do. The publisher, Kensington, and the Citadel imprint of Kensington was and is very pleased with The Confidante, and it continues to be consistent a seller, and people the feedback is uniformly good. So they gave me a 2-book deal, and the first of the 2 books is a book about Henri Matisse, the artist, and his family during the occupation of France.
Oh, wow.
And it's called Matisse at War, Art and Resistance in Occupied France, and it will come out in September. And the publisher and I are both very excited about it.
Cool. It sounds great. That's a particular period of time that you really like too, isn't it?
I really do. I'm a modern American history guy, so the World War II stuff I think comes easier for me when I'm writing. And so in this case, obviously the war is going on, so that's something that I'm familiar with in terms of putting it together. But what I found challenging, Diane, with this book was, you kind of have to get into the art. He's doing some revolutionary art at this time. He was kind of moving from painting to the cutouts, which he did with scissors and colored paper. And he was doing that in large part because he had stomach surgery, and he no longer could stand at the easel for any length of time.
Oh,
So
wow.
he's sitting up in bed, or indeed he's sitting in a chair or even a wheelchair, and he's able to have his assistant Lydia Delectorskaya paint these shades of paint on paper, and then he's starting to cut them out and create these cutouts. And as I point out in the book, some of these cutouts from the war years are very un-Matisseian in a way. Like, we think of Matisse as being sort of pleasant to the eye, but some of these are there's a sense of latent anguish in them. Or he did one called The Wolf, a cutout, which is very scary to look at in a way. It looks like its jaws are ready to bite. And it was at the moment where his daughter had been arrested by the Gestapo that he did that piece of work. So that's kind of putting the artistic response together with the circumstances.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for telling us about this
Yeah.
and also for being here as our January Art Saturday author. For those of you who'd like to get Chris's books or other of our books, please go to our bookstore where you will find them. Here it is right here. That's bookshop.org/shop/Drake Arts. We'd also like to thank our many donors for making this, oh my goodness, where did that go? For making this program possible. If without their generosity, we wouldn't be able to do this at all. Please consider becoming a donor yourself. To do that, go to drakeatarts.com/donate. To receive information about our programs or anything you'd like to ask us, please email us at drakeatarts@gmail.com or visit our website, drakeatarts.com. This and all our programs are archived on the Drake at Arts YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/@Drake at Arts. Thank you so much for being with us today. This has been really, really fabulous. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Chris. Yeah.